Hello, and welcome back to the beginning of a project that I have had in mind for quite a while. As part of this channel's recent focus on the Ancients period, I wanted to get off the beaten path and explore elements of that era that don't get talked about a lot and don't have a lot of games about them, while also bringing the actual history to the forefront. A lot of the time, I play historical games with an emphasis on the game part, which is focusing on the mechanics and the representation of the history as like a mechanism of play. And I want to turn that on its head. How can I use the mechanism of play as an enhancement to learning history via a YouTube video? So with that question in mind, I want to welcome you to a series I am calling The End of Antiquity, which will be a multi-part exploration of the 150 years between the fall of the Roman West in Italy and the rise of Islam in the 620s, all through the use of existing historical wargames. The primary focus will be shining a spotlight on this underappreciated era of transitional history, which also happens to be one of my favorites. Dominated by the reigns of the Roman emperors Justinian and Heraclius, I hope to bring a wider understanding and learning in a sort of broad narrative context about how the Roman Empire went from the Latin bedrock of the ancient world to a Greek-speaking, multi-ethnic crossroads nation poised at the hub of major transitional change from an ancient world to a medieval one. This century and a half is full of some of the most interesting, unique, and pivotal events and personalities that we've ever known, and we're going to see them on the tabletop set against the backdrop of wargaming. In part one of this series, the one you're watching right now, we're going to cover the history of Eastern Rome from the reign of the Emperor Anastasius to the beginning of the career of the Roman general Belisarius, conquering hero and heralded general of Constantinople. In future episodes, we'll focus in on the games themselves and play out the important moments of this period. In the meantime, I'm going to be using the maps and pieces from the games Justinian, designed by Richard Berg, and included in the Great Battles of History title Cataphract, and Belisarius, The Byzantine Empire Strikes, which is a strategy and tactics magazine game from 2002, designed by Joe Miranda, to illustrate this journey. So join me as we head back to the beginning of the 6th century Mediterranean. In 491, Anastasius Decorus became the Roman emperor. His accession to the throne was a result of the previous emperor's wife, Ariadne, selecting him to be emperor after receiving pressure to find an Orthodox Christian to take the role of Roman emperor. This move was reportedly opposed by the chariot racing team factions in Constantinople, whose prolific role in Constantinopolitan political and social affairs we will be talking a lot more about in future videos, so do not forget about them. Anastasius came from the Ministry of Finance, and his reign was characterized by an elimination of government corruption and economic policies that not only left the Roman treasury with a huge surplus, something future emperors would dip into prodigiously, but an efficient and smoothly operating bureaucratic administration. And in the early 500s, Anastasius also oversaw the war against Rome's most challenging rival in the East, the Persians. This would prove to be an extremely consequential conflict that would reverberate through Rome for decades. The Persian king Kavad I was in desperate need for money to pay his allies and shore up his ruling legitimacy in Persia. And when Anastasius refused to help, Kavad decided to try and take Rome's wealth by force along the eastern frontier. After the war ended in 505 with a truce, both sides having suffered horribly from the conflict, Anastasius built the fortress of Dara on the Roman-Persian border, a mere 30 kilometers from the existing Persian fortress of Nisibis. This would prove to be a major focal point of geopolitical relations, and something we're going to come back to. Anastasius died in 518 with no successor. He had 3 nephews who were widely considered to be near the top of the list as candidates to assume the throne, but there was a lot of intrigue in the palace, and this resulted in an unexpected outcome in terms of who would succeed Anastasius. Through a plot of treachery and bribes, the head of Anastasius's palace guard, who held the title of Comes Excubitorum, and who was an illiterate military veteran of Rome's recent wars, wound up becoming emperor. His name was Justin, no relation to me, and with the help of his soldiers in the palace, who now suddenly found themselves with a lot of coins in their coin purses, became the sole authority in the Roman Empire. Justin would rule for 9 years, and with the help of his well-educated and crafty nephew Flavius Petrus Sabatius, he would cement his rule by ruthlessly eliminating his political opponents domestically and using a diplomacy-focused strategy towards Rome's neighbors, trying to peel them away from Persia, and trying to bring Christian kingdoms in the Caucasus Mountains, which sat along the border with Persia, into Rome's sphere of influence. Underpinning Justin's reign was the canny political instincts of his nephew. Flavius Petrus Sabatius, for example, fell in love with a young actress in Constantinople's theater scene, and he influenced his uncle to overhaul the social rules that prohibited noble elites from marrying low-status civilians, which he successfully did. With the Persian king Kavad's reign coming to an end later in his life, Justin, the emperor, brokered a deal to adopt Kavad's son, Khusro, into the Roman imperial family, which would have made it more difficult for Kavad's brothers to usurp the throne from him when he died away from Khusro. And now, after initially agreeing to this deal, there's some evidence to suggest that Justin's nephew convinced Justin not to honor the deal as it was written up, with the claim that adopting the Persian prince would give Khusro a claim on the Roman throne at some point in the future as well, which was something that just was not, it was risky. They couldn't leave that door open. Kavad, of course, was enraged, and he immediately declared war on Rome and opened another massive conflict between the two world powers in the East. By this time, the emperor was in really bad health, and his nephew had been appointed consul and then co-emperor and was effectively running the realm. When Justin died in 518, Flavius Petrus Sabatius assumed the emperorship and became Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus Augustus, better known to us as Justinian. Justinian would prove to be one of the most important, impactful, and controversial emperors in Roman history, and we're going to talk a lot about him. Starting his reign in 527, Justinian had to contend with the Persians, the destruction of the Syrian city of Antioch by an earthquake in 526, and a schism in religious relations in the Orthodox Church of the East. Over the next several years after Justinian assumed the throne, Persian military incursions into Rome's eastern frontier would become a huge threat to the population of border cities and the integrity of the empire's military, which also had its hands full at the time in the Balkans against raids from the Slavs and the Bulgars. Now, remember the fortress of Dara that Anastasius built after the First Persian War? This heavily fortified base became the focal point of Rome's defense against the Persians. It had withstood Persian aggression in the east and was the main operating area that threatened a Roman counterattack into Persia. Kavad had to take it in order to press his advantage deep into Roman territory to win the war. After a string of Roman defeats at the hands of Kavad's experienced and deadly cavalry armies, the Emperor Justinian tapped a young man who had risen through the ranks of the imperial bodyguard to assume command in the east. His name was Belisarius, and as a massive Persian army marched on the fortress of Dara, Belisarius would not have much time to assemble a force capable of withstanding an overwhelming attack. Join me in the next episode as we play through the Battle of Dara, Belisarius' first victory that would establish his legacy as one of the greatest Roman generals of all time.